We think of ourselves as rational creatures during the day. But when the sun goes down, or we find ourselves alone in a strange place, or a familiar place turned suddenly strange, we lose that rationality. When hinges creak in doorless chambers, when we turn on the lights to stave away the things in the dark, we are ready to listen to grim stories. This is the Grim Stories Podcast. Listen to stories of the strange and creepy. Episode 1, Daddy. Written by Christopher O. Kinnan. Narrated by Grim Ginger. Lucy's father had the stroke shortly after he received the package from Aunt Lizzie. In her 10-year-old mind, she connected the events, but hadn't yet worked out exactly how they were related. Her father was a terrible person even before the stroke. This wasn't just Lucy's opinion, but the general opinion of everyone who had met her father over the course of his life. The best that could be said about him was that he was a mean drunk. In reality, he was mean sober as well. You could tell when he was in an especially foul mood, and during those times it was best to avoid him. He would pace around the house, breathing heavily, his eyes narrow and angry. If he locked onto you, he would find a reason to be pissed with you. No question had a correct answer, no action was without consequences. Lucy assumed her father loved her, despite all the evidence to the contrary. She was 10, she could be excused for not understanding that some people aren't capable of such complex emotions, that a parent wouldn't have their child's best interests at heart. After all, he never abused her. He had told her multiple times, usually after a beating. But Lucy also saw the good in her father. He worked a job he hated so they had a home and food on the table. Sometimes he even showed signs of guilt. Not often, but sometimes. The stroke, said her mother, had taken the wind out of his sails. He was paralyzed on one side and spent most of his time sleeping in the spare room. "Don't worry, honey," Lucy's mom said as she was leaving for work this morning. "He's an invalid now. If he takes a swing at you, you can dodge it." Lucy had looked up the word invalid, but wasn't sure it applied to her father. He still scared the piss out of her, even behind the closed door of the guest room. "I have to work a double shift," said her mother, as she bustled around the kitchen applying makeup and putting out food. "I won't be back until after midnight, so you'll have to feed Daddy. I put the food out for his lunch and dinner. Just bring it into his room and put it on the tray. Take the old tray to the kitchen. I'll clean the dishes in the morning." "Can you just put both in there now and let him feed himself?" asked Lucy. "He'll just knock it over, and then he'll be mad at both of us." Lucy's mother looked at herself in the mirror in the foyer, grimaced a bit at how she'd aged, then turned back to her daughter. "He may also want something to drink. He has a gallon water bottle, but he still will ask for a beer or something. The doctor said not to give him any alcohol, but the doctor doesn't live here, so it's okay. He gets mean when he drinks, Mom." "Hide his walker and you can outrun him," said her mother. "Remember, dear, you're in charge." Lucy nodded, but she knew that a 10-year-old is never in charge. Lucy remembered when her father came home from the hospital. He was using a rental wheelchair, and as they entered the house, she could hear her mother complaining about their shitty insurance and it wasn't going to cover the chair. That was the first time she had met her Aunt Lizzie, even though she only lived an hour away. She was on her father's right, his good side, smoking a cigarette. Her lip was curled slightly in what looked to Lucy like a smirk. She was the only adult who didn't seem to be angry. Her father looked like someone had turned off the left side of his body. His arm was limp in his lap, unmoving, and his leg flopped back and forth as the chair moved. His foot was secured to the footrest with a strap. But the worst part was his face. It sagged on the left side in an unnatural way, thought Lucy. Unnatural. That was the word that Lucy felt best described it. It was as if everything had come loose and gravity now owned it. The side of his mouth drooped, and his left eye just sort of bobbed there, never really locking onto anything. She almost ran when he called her name. Lucy, he croaked. Only with half his mouth, it sounded more like, Lizzie. Aunt Lizzie saw Lucy's fear. She took a drag on her cigarette and blew it out the side of her mouth. Maybe wait until you've learned to talk again, Billy. You're confusing the child. And you sound like a sick manatee. She winked at Lucy. Lucy followed at a safe distance as they moved her father into the spare room. It was never debated whether or not he would move or stay in the master. He was still shitting himself on occasion, so the master was out. Not for any practical reason, just that no one wanted the smell of shit stuck in the walls of the master bedroom. Lucy's mom didn't want to sleep with it, and her father was still under the impression he might get better. This was 1986, and people usually didn't get much better when they were half paralyzed and poor. But Lucy's father was a fighter, at least when it came to himself. Lucy's home was an old 3-bedroom rancher with most of the rooms clustered around a long hallway. Her mother called it the cell block. You entered the house either through the back kitchen door or through the front door that led to an adjoining dining room area. The dining room was up against a general-purpose room they called the den, which was L-shaped. One arm had the television and sofa and some beautifully garish faux wood paneling that Lucy's father had installed himself. The other arm was used, apparently, as a wildlife preserve for newspapers and assorted crap. In the middle of the longest wall was the hall leading to the cell block. Lucy watched from the beginning of the hall as her mother and Aunt Lizzie wheeled her father into the room at the opposite end. She could see them through the frame of the open doorway. It was like watching through a keyhole and trying to piece together the whole picture. Her father swore and slurred epithets as they worked him from the chair to the bed. Aunt Lizzie noticed her watching and slowly closed the door. Lucy's mother had prepared her father's lunch and placed it on a metal tray. The tray was black with gold leaf. Faux fancy, her mother would say. Her father's lunch was a peanut butter and strawberry jelly sandwich. There was an open can of mixed fruit, the snack size that Lucy often took with her school lunches. The grapes and cherries were the best, hiding in a swamp of syrup. There was a paper napkin, a bottle of water, a plastic spoon, and a small cup with his afternoon meds. Lucy had been instructed to open the bottle of water before leaving the food for her father. Lucy sat at the kitchen table, her head resting on her folded arms, staring at the lunch. Every few minutes she would glance at the clock on the kitchen wall. 12 noon, her mother had said. Lucy had no intention of starting a second before. It was now 11:56. Her father had started shouting for his food about 10 minutes earlier. At least she thought that's what he was saying. It came out as, Lucy, ingi ud. It sounded like a congested bear practicing his scales. All too soon it was noon. Lucy picked up the tray of food. Coming, Dad, she yelled. I was in the bathroom. She didn't really get creeped out until she reached the hallway. It seemed so much longer and ominous this time. There was a rectangle of thin light at the end of the hall, outlining her father's door. The rest of the hallway seemed unnaturally dim, lit only by a flickering overhead light that seemed to be illuminating way below its ability. Even as she felt the hallway rotating around her, she knew it was all in her mind. It was just a stronger version of what she felt whenever she approached her father, and wasn't sure what kind of mood he was in. She was pretty sure he wasn't going to be in the best of moods, so her anxiety was stronger. At least that's what she kept telling herself as she took each measured and intentional step down the hall and towards his door. Lucy, do you have my food? Asked her father in a totally normal voice. Her feet stopped as if magnetized to the floor. Why was he suddenly talking like a normal person, she wondered. "Coming, Daddy?" she said so softly she wasn't sure she had even spoken out loud. "Good girl. Daddy needs his strength. He needs to rebuild his goitee." Goitee? What the heck, thought Lucy. Lucy found she was standing just in front of the bedroom door. The light through the old keyhole seemed like a spotlight. Still holding the tray of food, she bent down to look through the keyhole. It took her eye a second to adjust to the lighting, then a second more to process what she was seeing. It was the guest room, same as always. The angle made it look artificial, like a dollhouse. She could see the bed, but her father wasn't in it. Lucy didn't understand that at all. He could barely get into the bed without help. He wore an adult diaper because he couldn't get to the bathroom on his own. Where did he go? For a jog? She tilted her head to try and see more of the room. Something moved against the keyhole, blocking her view. She straightened in surprise, but didn't drop the tray. "Lucy!" her father yelled like a wounded animal. Lucy balanced the tray on her hip and opened the door. The package that started it all arrived just days after Lucy's grandmother passed away. Her father hadn't gone to the funeral. Apparently, no one else had either. She was as terrible a person as Lucy's father, and almost certainly the reason he was the way he was. Lucy had never met her grandmother, and was only vaguely aware of her existence. The butt of a whispered joke or a reference her father made, a question from a friend of the family. Her grandmother had never visited and never been invited to do so. It was just one of those things. So when Lucy found the package sitting in front of their door, she gave it to her father without a thought. She did notice it came from her aunt, but assumed it was something adults send each other. The confused look on her father's face didn't register to Lucy any more than the state of global politics. She just went about her day. Later that day, her father had the stroke. She heard a crash in the den, her mother shout suddenly, then her mother on the phone. An ambulance arrived as Lucy watched from her bedroom. They put her father on a bed with folding wheels, which she thought was pretty cool, and took him away. There were many prayers throughout the community, but despite them, her father survived. Lucy's mother visited her father a few times when she didn't have work, which left Lucy to her own devices for much of the time. If she wasn't in school, she was at home watching television or reading. But every so often, she tried her hand at a bit of mischief. Nothing dramatic, but she did spend some time going through the off-limits closet and drawers of her parents' bedroom. She found little of interest to a 10-year-old. A few things law enforcement might find noteworthy, but nothing to write home about. In the bedroom trash can, which was well past full, was the disposed package wrapping. She took it out and looked at it, hoping to glean some magical message from it. Nothing. Her father's name and address, her aunt's name and address, and nothing else. There wasn't even a stamp on it. Just brown paper wrapping. She tossed it back. The night before her father was scheduled to return home, Lucy had a dream. She was sitting in the den with her dead grandmother she had never met. No matter how hard Lucy tried to see her face, it was just a blur. Sort of like when you tried to read in a dream. Features flowing around and refusing to stay put. But she knew it was her grandmother. And yet, it was also her father. He reached out to her, his arm in a woman's housecoat, and said, "Lucy." Her father was in the bed, propped up on several pillows. A thin sheet was crumpled around his lower body. To the right of the bed was a small folding TV dinner table. The remains of her father's breakfast were on the table, as well as a half-empty jug of water with a long straw. He looked totally incapable of moving very far on his own. "Lucy," he said through half a functioning mouth. It looked like he was trying to smile, but Lucy couldn't really tell for certain. She rarely saw her father smile in any case, so she had little to compare it to. Lucy's eyes darted around the room as she put the lunch tray on the floor. She picked up the breakfast tray gingerly, as if it might be hot. It wasn't. She placed it on the floor as well, then put the lunch tray on the table. She opened the bottle of water and placed everything within her father's reach. He watched her with his good eye. The other tended to its own business. "Enjoy," said Lucy as she reached for the breakfast tray. "Ate," her father said. "Gers?" He gestured with his good hand at the sheets that were bunched out of his reach. Lucy shuddered a little, then grabbed the edges of the sheets and pulled it up to her father's chest. As she did, she glanced up at him. His dead eye was looking right at her. Lucy stepped away quickly, picked up the breakfast tray, and ran out of the room. Lucy's mother had left 3 numbers on the refrigerator. 911, and in case Lucy couldn't remember that one, the number to her mother's job and the number to Aunt Lizzie. She took down Aunt Lizzie's number and dialed it carefully on the large beige phone attached to the wall. As it rang, she twirled the receiver's cord like a small lasso. Aunt Lizzie answered on the 4th ring. "Yeah?" Lucy was silent for a moment. She hadn't really thought this far ahead. "Aunt Lizzie, this is Lucy." "Is he dead?" she asked. "No." "Oh well. What's up, Lucy? You okay?" Lucy heard her aunt take a drag on her cigarette. "Yes, I think so, yes. Daddy is just acting strange." "How so? Did he mess himself?" asked Aunt Lizzie. "No, Mom said not to worry about that because he has a diaper. It's just, can he walk around on his own?" "Walk? Like normal walk?" "Nah, not unless Jesus is taking the wheel. His whole side is useless. Can't even talk without sounding like a retard." Lucy nodded to the phone. "That's what I thought, only..." Aunt Lizzie took another drag. She sounded slightly bored. "Really what, sweetie?" Lucy blurted it all out in one fast sentence. "He wasn't in his bed when I looked through the keyhole, then he was, and I opened the door, and he sometimes talks normal and sometimes he doesn't, and his fisheye looked at me." "A stroke can do weird as shit things to a person, Lucy, and being alone in a house with an invalid can make a little girl imagine all sorts of things. I'm sure it's all totally normal." "When he was talking normal, he used a word I didn't know," said Lucy. "He probably uses a lot of words you shouldn't know." "Oh, I know all the bad ones, mostly. But he said he needs to build his goatee. What's a goatee?" Aunt Lizzie was so quiet for so long that Lucy thought the line had gone dead. "Aunt Lizzie? You sure used that word? It wasn't slurred?" "No, it was said normal," said Lucy. "Sweetie, as far as you know, did your daddy go to our mother's funeral, even a little bit?" Aunt Lizzie's voice was alert and focused. It made Lucy a little uncomfortable. "No, he stayed home the whole time. He didn't even leave the den until your package arrived." "My package? I didn't send Billy anything." "Well, it said it was from you." Lucy shrugged. "And then he had his stroke." Aunt Lizzie exhaled slowly while whispering, "Fuck." She coughed a little at the end. "Listen, dear," said Aunt Lizzie. "Don't go in his room until I get there. I'm only about 45 minutes away." "Is it something bad?" asked Lucy. No, lied Aunt Lizzie. "Well, I don't want you to worry. Sit tight, dear." And then she hung up. Lucy had every intention of avoiding her father until Aunt Lizzie arrived. But Aunt Lizzie was running late, and her father had started asking for a beer. Although asking wasn't quite the right word. "Lizzie, bring him here," he shouted again in his hoarse but very loud voice. Lucy sat at the kitchen table with her hands over her ears and her eyes shut tight. But she could still hear her father calling, almost constantly now. And the more he called out, the tighter her stomach clenched. She knew that the longer you made him wait, the angrier he became. Lucy peeked at the clock. It was 3:30 p.m. Where was Aunt Lizzie? Then, Lucy heard her father clearly say, "Please bring your daddy a beer, dear. He needs to sleep so I can work." She was already out of the kitchen before she realized how strange that sentence sounded, and how strange it was that she was doing it. She stood in the hallway, looking down at the beer in her hands. When had she decided to give her father a beer? The clock on the wall said 3:42 p.m. "You're very strong, Lucy," said her father. "Girls in our bloodline always are. Not weak little things like your father. He couldn't even handle the transition. Now I'm stuck sharing this broken body of his, like swimming in a suit of armor." But, of course, by now Lucy knew it wasn't her father talking. At least not always. Not now. "Are you my grandmother?" she asked. Her father chuckled. "Close enough. Come on along and we can talk. Your father is still struggling with me, although he isn't really aware of it. It's making everything take longer than necessary." Lucy was slowly walking towards the end of the hall. She'd never had a grandmother before. Her mom's mother died before she was born. Everyone should meet their grandmother, right? Lucy wasn't sure if she opened the bedroom door or if it opened for her. It was hard to focus, and her vision was a little blurry around the edges. "Thank you, Lucy," said her father. He reached out clumsily with his good hand towards the beer. Lucy put it in his hand, making sure he had a good grip before letting go. He smiled at her with a half-twisted grimace and drank the beer. He chugged it down without pause, then handed the empty back. "I feel better now," he said, and laid back against his pillow. Lucy watched her father as his good eye became heavy, then closed. Nothing moved except for the rising and falling of his breathing. Then the bad eye swiveled to look at Lucy. "He's finally asleep. Thank you, dear," her father said. "Let's have a chat, shall we?" And her father sat up, his good side now slack and his paralyzed side totally animate. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and faced Lucy. "You probably have a million questions." This is the end of part 1 of Daddy. Subscribe to Grim Stories and find out what happens next.